I shouldn't have taken the night shift at Morton University's library. The extra pay wasn't worth what I discovered that winter evening in December. As a graduate student in forensic psychology, I thought I'd seen and read about the darkest corners of human behavior. I was wrong. My shift started at 8 p.m., just as most students were filtering out for the night. I settled into my usual spot at the front desk, ready for another quiet evening of dissertation work between the occasional patron needing help. The library was particularly empty that night. Final exams had finished the day before, and most students had already left for winter break. Around 10 p.m., I noticed something odd on the security feed. The camera covering the rare books section showed a book lying open on one of the tables. I was certain I'd locked that section earlier, and nobody had requested access. University policy required staff to investigate any unusual activity, so I grabbed my flashlight and master key. The walk to the rare books section felt longer than usual. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, and the emergency lights cast an eerie red glow that barely penetrated the darkness. I noticed something strange as I approached. There were footprints in the dust leading to the section, but none leading away. My forensics training kicked in as I examined the prints. They were fresh, made by someone wearing dress shoes, probably male based on the size. But what made my blood run cold was the smeared fingerprint on the wall. It was reddish-brown and looked horribly like dried blood. The rare books room was empty when I entered, but someone had definitely been there. Papers were scattered across one of the antique desks, and a coffee cup had been knocked over, its contents still wet. I approached the open book on the table, and my heart nearly stopped. It was a collection of newspaper clippings about student disappearances at Morton University, dating back to the 1960s. I rushed back to the security office and called campus police. While waiting, I checked the security footage, rewinding to see who had entered the rare books section. To my horror, the footage showed the book opening by itself at 9:47 p.m. No one had entered the room. That's when I heard it, a loud bang from the basement level. The maintenance tunnels ran underneath the entire library, connecting it to other campus buildings. Against my better judgment, I took my flashlight and went to investigate. The maintenance door was slightly open, and I could have sworn I saw a shadow move through the gap. In the maintenance room, I found an old filing cabinet with its drawer left open. Inside were personnel files, dozens of them, all belonging to former maintenance workers who had mysteriously resigned or disappeared over the past several decades. One file was newer than the others, belonging to a James Morton, the university founder's great-grandson. His file noted that he'd been fired 3 months ago for erratic behavior and concerning interactions with students. My flashlight beam caught something on the wall, another bloody handprint, larger this time, next to a hanging maintenance uniform. On the floor beneath it was a student ID card belonging to Sarah Chen, a freshman who'd been reported missing 2 weeks ago. I heard footsteps behind me, accompanied by the jangling of keys. I ran. The sound of heavy footsteps followed me through the maintenance tunnels and up the stairs. I didn't stop until I reached the main floor, where I found campus police officers with their weapons drawn. They'd received multiple silent alarms from the basement level. The investigation that followed revealed the horrible truth. James Morton had been using his maintenance access to stalk students, collecting trophies in a hidden room deep in the tunnel system. They found evidence connecting him to 12 disappearances over the past year alone. The blood belonged to his latest victim, Sarah Chen, who they found alive but traumatized in that hidden room. I still work at Morton University Library, but never alone, and never at night. Sometimes, when I walk past the rare book section, I think about that book of newspaper clippings. It was logged into evidence, but mysteriously disappeared a week later. I've since learned that some of the older librarians believe the library itself tries to protect its patrons, revealing dangers to those willing to pay attention. I don't know if I believe that, but I do know one thing. Evil doesn't need to be supernatural to haunt you forever. The psychology department at Blackwood University had always pushed ethical boundaries with its research. But as a third-year PhD candidate, I never expected to become the whistleblower. What started as an innovative sleep study would reveal something far more sinister in those sterile laboratories. Dr. Marcus Chen's sleep deprivation study promised to revolutionize our understanding of consciousness. As his research assistant, I had front-row access to what the university touted as groundbreaking science. The grant money was astronomical, and the preliminary results were unlike anything I'd seen in my years of cognitive research. The first red flag appeared during week 3. Our subject, a sophomore named Tyler, started experiencing severe anxiety during the controlled wake periods. Protocol dictated we should have terminated his participation, but Dr. Chen insisted we continue. Breakthrough science requires sacrifice, he said, adjusting Tyler's electrodes with unsettling enthusiasm. Late one night, I noticed the biometric lock on Lab C had been accessed at odd hours, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., times when no authorized research was scheduled. The login belonged to Dr. Chen, but he'd specifically told the ethics committee all experiments were conducted during daylight hours. Looking through his notes, my stomach turned. The approved sleep deprivation periods were 48 hours, but Dr. Chen had been pushing subjects well beyond 72 hours. Worse, he'd been administering unauthorized substances, experimental stimulants, that weren't mentioned in any of our official documentation. I was working late, gathering evidence in the parking garage when I first realized I was being followed. The security camera near my usual spot hung loose from its mount, and I could have sworn I heard footsteps echoing behind my own. That night, my car wouldn't start. Someone had cut the brake lines. The dean's response to my evidence was unexpected. Instead of shock or concern, Dr. Patricia Walsh seemed unsurprised. The psychology department has always been progressive in its methods, she said, sliding a folder across her desk. Inside were photos, decades of similar experiments, all swept under the rug. I started setting up hidden cameras in the lab's storage room. What I captured turned my blood cold. Dr. Chen wasn't just conducting unauthorized experiments. He was using the results to identify vulnerable subjects, students he could manipulate into increasingly dangerous trials. The sleep study was just the beginning. The threats started coming by email. Anonymous messages describing my daily routine with disturbing accuracy. Photos of me sleeping in my apartment. A list of my family members' addresses. Someone had access to everything about my life, and they wanted me to understand the consequences of continuing my investigation. During a late-night faculty meeting, I presented my findings. The department heads sat in stunned silence as I showed them the video evidence, the falsified data, the medical records of students who'd suffered permanent psychological damage. That's when Dr. Chen calmly stood up and played his own presentation. They were all involved. The sleep study was just one small part of a decades-long research program, sanctioned at the highest levels of the university. The dean, the ethics committee, even the hospital psychiatrists who treated the unsuccessful subjects. They'd built their careers on this corruption. I barely made it out of that meeting alive. Running through the halls, I could hear them behind me, faculty members I'd once respected, now pursuing me like a pack of wolves. I had copies of everything backed up, already sent to 3 different news outlets. They couldn't stop the truth from coming out. The story broke nationally 2 days later. Federal investigators descended on Blackwood University, and the arrests made headlines for weeks. Chen and 16 other faculty members were indicted. The dean committed suicide before they could take her into custody. Over 300 former students came forward with their own horror stories. I testified at the trials, but the full scope of what happened at Blackwood may never be known. Some records were destroyed, some victims still won't speak, and some experiments were too well hidden to trace. I transferred to finish my PhD at another university, but I can't shake the feeling that Blackwood wasn't unique. How many other institutions are out there, pushing the boundaries of ethics under the guise of scientific progress? How many other students are strapped to chairs right now, wondering if they made a terrible mistake by signing up for an innocent-sounding psychology experiment? Sometimes I still dream about those labs, about the hidden cameras and the falsified data and the sound of footsteps behind me in the parking garage. Science is supposed to help us understand the darkness in human nature, not become a vehicle for it. But I learned at Blackwood that the scariest monsters aren't supernatural. They're the ones with PhDs and tenure, the ones who believe that knowledge justifies any means of obtaining it. The anatomy lab at Riverside Medical University was my second home. As a first-year medical student, I spent countless hours memorizing every muscle, nerve, and vessel. But when our professor assigned us partners for the special summer research project, I never imagined I'd uncover a century-old secret that would make me question everything about modern medicine. My partner James was brilliant but odd. He had an unusual fascination with 19th century medical practices and kept talking about some revolutionary technique developed by a Dr. Heinrich Werner in 1888. I humored him at first, helping him dig through ancient textbooks in the university's archives. The basement archives held more than just books. Behind a rusted metal door, we found Dr. Werner's private collection. Dozens of specimen jars containing preserved human tissue, each labeled with cryptic notes in faded German handwriting. The preservation technique was unlike anything in modern textbooks. James became obsessed with Werner's journal. The anatomical drawings were incredibly detailed, but something was off about the proportions. The mathematical formulas in the margins seemed to describe something impossible, a way to preserve living tissue indefinitely while maintaining its function. I started noticing changes in James. He stopped attending regular classes, spending all his time in the private research lab he'd somehow gained access to. The equipment he brought in was ancient, modified with modern components in ways that violated every safety protocol I knew. Following him one night, I discovered he was using the old maintenance tunnels beneath the medical campus. They connected to a sealed wing of the original 1880s hospital building. The walls were lined with primitive electrical equipment that hummed with unexplained energy. The old hospital wing contained Werner's original laboratory, perfectly preserved. James had restored the equipment using modern power sources. The centerpiece was a massive electrical apparatus that looked like a horrific fusion of 19th century technology and contemporary medical equipment. When I confronted him, James proudly showed me his work. The specimens on the table were fresh, too fresh. He'd been combining Werner's preservation technique with modern surgical methods. The tissue samples were technically dead, but under the microscope, the cells were still metabolically active weeks later. The truth emerged in pieces. The missing medical supplies reported throughout the semester. The late-night deliveries from local hospitals' tissue banks. The power surges that the maintenance staff couldn't explain. James hadn't just been experimenting with preservation, he'd been working toward full reanimation. The body under the sheet was one of our anatomy lab cadavers. James had somehow smuggled it into Werner's lab. The official medical examiner's report later confirmed my worst fears. The tissue samples showed signs of cellular activity long after the documented time of death. The university tried to bury the story, but the federal investigation was too big to hide. They found evidence that James wasn't the first to rediscover Werner's work. Generations of medical students had found those journals, and some had taken the research even further. There were similar labs hidden in medical schools across the country. The ethical implications shook the medical community. Werner's technique represented a fundamental violation of natural law, but its potential applications were revolutionary. Tissue that never dies, organs that remain viable indefinitely, the ability to preserve neural tissue without degradation. I transferred to another medical school, but I couldn't escape the implications of what we'd discovered. Every time I enter an anatomy lab, I find myself questioning the true nature of life and death. The line between pioneering medical research and playing God is razor thin, and some knowledge comes at too high a price. James was committed to a psychiatric facility, but his research notes disappeared from evidence. Sometimes I lie awake wondering who has them now. In labs across the world, brilliant minds push the boundaries of medical science every day. But late at night, in the quiet corners of old hospitals and medical schools, how many of them are secretly following in Werner's footsteps, searching for that elusive boundary between death and something else? Modern medicine is built on centuries of ethical violations and questionable experiments. We tell ourselves we're beyond that now, that we've evolved. But in every medical student's eyes, I see that same hunger for knowledge that consumed James, that drove Werner to his impossible discoveries. The most terrifying truth I learned that summer wasn't about death. It was about the lengths humans will go to defeat it.